5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. Has it been live? Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, there's so much going on, we barely can keep up with it. But we're going to talk about something tonight that's near and dear to my heart, having been an educator for 51 years, before that a graduate student and an undergraduate student. We're going to talk about Trump's war on education, what it means for research and the pursuit of knowledge, and what it means for the continuation of our democracy. From my perspective, there's hardly anything more important than that.
I want to give some shout-outs. I see some people in the chat. Pam Ponzart, Maths OP, Bob Chris Rofero, Alex Moreno, Peter Collingswood, RV Davey, Abe, Karen Strickler, Rob Z, Elijah the Wolf. I just want to, I like people are interacting with the chat. I like to give them shout outs, right, Dad?
Absolutely. Do you want to do your housekeeping, or should I get into it?
No, I do usually do the housekeeping after we finish the first talk section. But before you do that, I just want to say later we will hear from our sponsor of today's video, Ground News. But before that, let's start with the Department of Education and education in general, Dad. Trump today signed an executive order dismantling parts of the Department of Education, but also he can't do that. It has to go through Congress. So what the hell's going on, Dad?
Trump wants to put education under his thumb, just as he wants to put Congress and the courts under his thumb. He doesn't want to make education better. He doesn't want to advance the pursuit of knowledge, the quest for truth. They note that in the modern world, it comes from within, and it doesn't come from the use of military force or suppression, although that's part of it, but rather the central way in which from within we get a coup that establishes an authoritarian government is through the control of knowledge and information. And of course, the core of that is the free press, and we'll have a separate segment on that. And of course, a fair, free education system that's not being dictated to by political or authoritarian impulses. Now, he is doing his best to dismantle the Department of Education. He shouldn't be able to do it because, as you point out, Sam, the Department of Education was not established by executive order. It was established way back in the Jimmy Carter administration in the 1970s by an act of Congress. And we do have, at least we have had until recent weeks, American democracy grounded in the balance of power between the three branches of government to prevent tyranny, the executive, the Congress, and the courts. And Donald Trump only recognizes one branch. And what branch is that, Sam?
His right arm.
Exactly. I can do anything I want as president. Hail the king. I'm saving the country, so I am bound by no laws. This is very frightening. He should not be able to dismantle, even in effect, without maybe formally getting the law repealed, a department established by a separate branch of government, an act of the Congress of the United States. Now, the abolition of the Department of Justice, or the dismantling, or the crippling, we haven't seen the full ramifications yet, has dire implications for American education from K to 12 through colleges and universities. It is the Department of Education that administers student loans and student grants, while apparently so far those have not been undermined. Who knows what might happen in the next weeks or maybe in the next days. It makes sure at every level of education, everyone has equal access. you're not discriminated against because you're a minority, or because, like me, you're an older American, or you're someone with disabilities. Tens of millions of Americans have disabilities. It's not a minor issue, and education that takes into account people with disabilities is in grave jeopardy. Aid to financially scrapped school districts is in grave jeopardy, including such critical programs as school lunch programs. And what states are going to be hit the hardest by the either elimination or the diminution of Department of Education grants to financially strapped school districts?
Red states.
Exactly. It's going to be poor states like Alabama and Mississippi that are going to be hit the hardest. But maybe they don't care, because in the most financially strapped school districts, what is the racial composition to a great extent of the students?
They're African American or Latino?
They're minorities, exactly. The poorest districts also tend to be heavily minority. The Department of Education also upholds the highest possible academic standards, and that is likely to go by the boards as well, because Trump doesn't want high academic standards. He wants educators at every level to conform to his own political orthodoxy. We've seen that even before Trump took office. We've seen that taking place in the states, in places like Florida, Texas. In Florida, a few years ago, the Commissioner of Education, Corcoran, said, you have to police the teachers on a daily basis. And what are you policing them for? To make sure that they teach according to Republican orthodoxy, which is to downplay both the history of discrimination in America and to deny that there is any existing discrimination. All of this has nothing to do with academics or scholarship. It's politically driven. The overwhelming thrust of scholarship is just the opposite. These bogus ideas about American history and American society were inscribed in the end of the first Trump administration in the so-called Project 1776, a rewriting of American history and the current status of American society. It was so fundamentally flawed that dozens of the nation's leading academic organizations came out of their usual hibernation to denounce the project. The executive director of the American Historical Association said this project was totally unhinged from the last 40 years of scholarship. They don't care about scholarship. They don't care about the truth. They only want their own political orthodoxy reflected at every level of American education. But they haven't stopped, by no means, with dismantling the Department of Education. They have directly gone after American colleges and universities by using all kinds of pretexts to threaten them with the withdrawal of federal grants, which is very important for their research and scholarship. I believe, at least temporarily, they've already withdrawn hundreds of millions of dollars from Columbia University and withdrawn monies from other universities as well. What is equally frightening, they've gone after the university curriculum. Fundamental violation of academic freedom. Political appointees of Donald Trump should not be controlling the curriculum of our great colleges and universities. Our colleges and universities have been the envy of the world. In many ways, they are the crown jewel of American society. That is, it is through research, through scholarship, through education, that we have had fundamental breakthroughs in medicine and healthcare that have literally saved millions of lives and saved millions of people from suffering. Research and scholarship at our colleges and universities have had an enormous positive impact across the board in American society, whether it's transportation, safety, agriculture, aviation, you name it. Every part of American society upon which we, the people, ordinary folk, depend, has been enormously enhanced by research and scholarship at our fine colleges and universities that Trump is now trying to destroy and replace it with political orthodoxy. There's wonderful analysis in the New York Times which points about the great dangers of what's going on in higher education. And, you know, being a professor for 51 years, this is near and dear to my heart.
Wait, hold on. You've been a professor for 51 years?
1973. You can do the math. You're a smart kid.
So since you were 6 years old?
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Pretty much.
Wow. I didn't realize you were a professor since you were 6 years old.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Everybody knows, you know, how young I was.
Right.
2 months, I'm quoting, 2 months into Mr. Trump's term, universities are laying off workers, imposing hiring freeze, shutting down their laboratories, and facing federal investigations. After the administration sent Columbia a list of demands, political demands, and canceled $400 million in grants and contracts, university leaders across the country fear how the government might wield its financial might, not just to influence research, but to influence curricula, staffing, and admissions. You know, you undermine research, you undermine scholarship. You make Americans less healthy, less safe. And, you know, I'm not in the scientific and technical fields, but the humanities, you know, the books that we produce, the lectures that we give, greatly enrich the lives of the American people. And, you know, if you force us just to mouth political propaganda, then every American is going to be deprived of the kind of information, insights, narratives that enrich your lives. Donald Trump claims to be for the little guy, and yet everything he's doing in education reverberates to the ultimate detriment of the average American. Now, Sam, there are a few other things on my mind.
Before we get to that, we're going to stop for a moment and hear from ground news.
Oh, I love ground news. Yeah.
Me too.
I want to talk to you again about accuracy and bias in the media. Staying informed without falling for misleading narratives has never been more important. That's why I use Ground News, a website and app that pulls articles from all over the world and organizes them by story. It lets you compare how different outlets cover the same event, complete with context and visual breakdowns of the sources. Take the story. Dodge gains access to U.S. Institute of Peace after Trump administration overhauls board. Over 100 news sources covered this story, with 77% of the bias coming from the center. Even more impressive, 96% of these sources are rated as highly factual, and 8% are from independent outlets. One feature I find incredibly valuable is the bias distribution bar, a visual breakdown of where sources fall on the political spectrum. You'll also notice how word choice shapes narratives. Right-leaning sources focus on terms like standoff and government cutters, while left-leaning outlets highlight storms and guts. Seeing these differences side by side makes it crystal clear how agendas play into news coverage. Ground news also shows you who owns the media you're reading and how factual their reporting is. Two things essential in getting to the truth. Another feature I love, the Discover and Interest pages. You can follow topics like U.S. politics or the White House and stay up to date with breaking stories. It's a personalized way to track the news that matters without being overwhelmed. Go to ground.news/Allan, that's ALLAN, or scan the QR code to subscribe. By using my link, you get 40% off the Vantage plan, just $5 a month, and you'll be directly supporting my work. In a world where news moves fast and the truth is often hard to find, Ground News helps you stay informed and see the bigger picture. Don't wait. Check it out today.
Thank you to Ground News. That's ground.news/Allan. The link to his page is also in the description of this video. All right, Dad, what else is on your mind today?
I want to make one more comment about education, and I'll show you a few of the things that I'm worried about. I am not saying that education doesn't need reform. It does, but it doesn't need the kind of destructive so-called reform that this administration is inflicting upon higher education. I have long been an advocate of reform, going way back to the 1990s when I was a little older than 6. I did analyses showing that there was a disturbing trend in higher education, and that is a middle management administrative bloat with resources being directed to administration that I thought should be directed to education and research. And I've been an advocate of that for a very long time. I've also thought tuition was too high, pricing too many people out of the market. So I'm not an apologist by any stretch of the imagination for higher education. I'm a reformer, but you got to do reform the right way. All right.
Go ahead.
What else is on my mind? Of course, Elon Musk, who maybe bought the presidential election for Trump, but that's another topic. I don't want to get into that, is now trying to buy a state Supreme Court seat. Do you know what I'm talking about, Sam?
In Wisconsin.
Yes. And why is Wisconsin important?
It's a swing state.
It's a swing state, and the state Supreme Court, pending this election, is 3 liberals and 3 conservatives. So the outcome of this election, and early voting has already started. I think everything ends on April 1, April Fool. Maybe that's very apropos. And Elon Musk, who, despite losing at least $100 billion because of what's happened with Tesla, is still worth over $300 billion, still the richest person in the world, still richer than most nations, is trying to buy this seat for the conservative Republican candidate. This election is likely to set a record for spending. State judge elections usually are low visibility, low spending. But, this election, Musk and his funded political action committees have already spent well north of 10 million. Sometimes it's easy to slip into billion with Musk. Well north of 10 million, and some say it could go as high as $50 million or higher. Just absolutely unprecedented for a state Supreme Court election. Why does Musk care? 2 reasons. One, he has a direct, blatant conflict of interest because Tesla is suing Wisconsin, which has ruled that they can't establish dealerships in the state because they own the manufacturing company. So he's got a direct financial stake in this. And, of course, he desperately wants to see the state Supreme Court turn to the right, which could, authorize once again the gerrymandering of the Wisconsin state legislature was probably the worst state legislative gerrymandering in the country until the 4-3 progressive majority overturned it. It would have profound implications for labor, for collective bargaining, for voting rights in the state, and profoundly influence as well the presidential election in this, ultimate swing state in 2024. It just proves something I've been saying. In politics is kind of the reversal of the golden rule. That is, it is whoever has the gold rules. And, I've said this so many times, from 1989 to the present, 13 plus trillion dollars, trillion, not billion, has been transferred from 99% of us to the top 1%. That's thousands of dollars for every family. Far more than you pay, in fact, for the average family, far more than you pay in personal federal income taxes. And, a lot of this culture war stuff on the part of Trump and his allies is a way of diverting our attention from the real problem, not just in the United States, but worldwide, the amassing of just obscene, immense amounts of wealth in a very few hands, which enables, a tiny number of individuals to have overwhelming influence over our society and our politics. And everything that Trump is doing is just making this worse. As he once said, I'm going to make you guys who are rich even richer. And, I don't care how rich you are. History shows no matter how rich someone gets, they always want more. That's how they got so rich in the first place. More. I'm only worth $300 billion. More. All right. What else is on my mind?
I don't know.
Is Trump's attacking the courts.
Okay.
There was a judge who ruled that Trump's deportations under the so-called 18th Century Alien Enemies Act was illegal, and they had to turn the planes around. That these were supposedly members of a terrorist gang, but there had been, even if they were, the judge said you could not invoke this 18th Century Act, which is designed for declared wars. But they hadn't proven anything about whether these people really were aligned with a terrorist gang. And they didn't turn the planes around without any due process, without any proof that any of these folks had done anything wrong. They sent them to maybe the worst prison in the world, the hellhole prison in El Salvador, which is famous for its cruel, unusual, inhumane treatment of prisoners. We've never seen, Trump has a phrase he uses all the time, never seen anything like this. Well, this time we have truly never seen anything like this. And this is a judge that Trump has said should be impeached. He backed off a little bit on the impeachment because of the backlash, but he's still attacking the judge and still undermining the critical role of the judiciary in maintaining our freedoms and our democracy. Apropos of this, he's also swept up another student who's here legally, Suri Khan, who's on a fellowship, I think it's George Washington, or maybe it's Georgetown.
I think you said it was Georgetown.
Georgetown. I think it's George. I always get the two mixed up, who cares? And claiming, he has somehow ties to terrorism. No proof, no warrant, no judicial process. Apparently they came at night, armed and spirited him away. He's got a wife and a kid here, and I understand his wife is a U.S. citizen. So basically, by fiat, even when it comes to those who are immigrants who are here legally, the Trump administration thinks in fundamental violations of people's rights, it can seize them, detain them, even sentence them to the most hellish possible punishments. And it may be most or none of those people sent off to El Salvador have done anything wrong at all. We just don't know. We have never, in the history of the country, seen anything like this. Basically, political prisoners, and, probably that hellhole in El Salvador is as bad or worse than the Gulag. You know what the Gulag is, Sam?
The Russian prison?
The Russian prison where they, sent their political prisoners to work to death, or at least to work, to exhaustion and under totally inhumane conditions. We sort of have our own Gulag now in El Salvador. It's just, I sort of run out of words of outrage, but I'm going to keep speaking out.
As you should, Dad.
Thank you.
Anything else on your mind before we get to questions?
There's always a lot more on my mind. But, and again, I cannot overstress the importance of maintaining an education system that supports those with disabilities, poor children, minorities, that's dedicated not to a political agenda, but to discovering the truth, to doing life-saving, critical research, and to molding young people to think for themselves, to be critical. That is anathema to every authoritarian regime in the history of the world. The last thing they ever want is for people to be able to think critically, think for themselves, and not simply swallow propaganda coming from an authoritarian government.
Why do you think so many people put so much blame on the Department of Education? Is it just totally politically motivated? Because I imagine, your average American is probably sitting at home and thinking, the U.S. education system isn't working that well. Maybe that's what we need to do. Maybe we need to uproot something crazy like the Department of Education.
It's a very good point. Remember what I said at the end of my talk. Education needs reform. No doubt about it. I'm most familiar with higher education, and I expressed the kinds of reforms I thought were needed. But yeah, all of our education can use upgrading and reform. But you don't achieve reform and positive change by torpedoing education, and you certainly don't do it by imposing a political orthodoxy upon education. But it goes beyond that. You're right. A lot of Trump's attack on education resonates because people are thinking, this is just a privileged elite. Why should they have a department dedicated to them? Why should they be getting all this federal money? Harvard's rich enough. Columbia's rich enough. They don't realize, first of all, that this federal money is so essential to research that has saved trillions of dollars and millions of lives, nor that they realize how critical the Department of Education is to elementary and secondary education, for school lunches, for dealing with students with disabilities. And there are tens of millions of people with disabilities in America, for dealing with poor districts. And then the third thing I would say, messaging, right, Sam?
Right.
Progressive messaging has been so horrendous that, there really isn't an effective counter to the very persuasive messaging that comes out of Trump. Trump is the all-time grifter, the all-time con man. He can sell, as they say, he could sell snow to New Hampshire.
Yeah. I think from what I've seen recently, I've seen Bernie Sanders and AOC really getting out there and trying to spread a clear, concise, progressive message. So maybe that's
a start.
Yeah.
I've had my differences with Bernie, but I've praised him. I've said, yes, he is, along with AOC, the two most effective messengers for the Democratic Party. And Bernie has put his finger on what may be the most needed reform. And of course, the Trump administration is going in the opposite direction, and that is the taxing of wealth. I wonder if Elon Musk pays any taxes. I'd be surprised if he paid more than a token amount of taxes.
Yeah. The other issue is, similarly, I feel like, we're sitting here, I think, nobly, arguing for due process and for these asylum seekers and immigrants to have their time in court and be processed accordingly. But I fear that most Americans probably think Trump's getting rid of all these gang members. If, a few immigrants who aren't supposed to be here anyway go home, who cares?
You're 100% right again. I wrote a whole op-ed on this in the Tampa Bay Times about a month ago, based on my work as an expert witness in Florida in representing and working with plaintiffs who were challenging their anti-sanctuary city laws. And this was several years ago. And they were justifying that law the same way Trump is justifying his mass deportations. It's all about public safety. We're not interested in, the hardworking immigrant, whether documented or not, who's contributing. We just want to get these violent criminals off the street, right?
Right.
And what my data showed, and I had privileged access because of the court case, is they were detaining virtually no violent criminals. The vast majority were people with no criminal record or minor traffic violations. There's a big catch-22 in Florida. You can't have a driver's license if you're not documented, but if you drive without a driver's license, you can be arrested and detained if you're an undocumented immigrant. Virtually no violent criminals in the hundreds of persons that I looked at that were detained under the act. It was almost always people with trivial violations. In addition, there's a outfit at the University of Syracuse called TRACK, which tracks, it's invaluable if you're at all interested in what's going on with deportations and detentions by ICE. Look up TRACK, TRAC, all in caps. And what they found, remember what Trump said, like the folks in Florida, we're just going to get rid of these, dangerous criminals, right? Maybe later down the road somewhere we'll deal with other, but we're going to prioritize all of these dangerous, cutthroat immigrants who are out to kill you, right? Mm-hmm. Half of those just early on detained had zero criminal record. Zero criminal record. If there are all these criminals out there, then these early detentions should have, gone after the low-hanging fruit, and it should have been all virtually serious criminals. In fact, half of them had no criminal record. TRACK did not have the detailed criminal record of the other half, but I'll bet a lot of it was trivial violations, not kidnapping, rape, or murder, as my research showed in Florida.
Sometimes you just end abruptly.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm old. I sometimes run out of steam.
I get that.
I'm not young and sharp like you.
Before we move to questions, some housekeeping stuff. We've got 1,300 people watching, but only 539 likes. Guys, give the stream a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. I saw someone ask earlier in the chat, why doesn't my question get answered? Well, we're trying to make this a business here, so
we keep going.
Right. So because of that,
we're not going to get rich, but we need to keep going.
To get your question in line for this man, Allan Lichtman, you got to either donate or be a member. So we got no new members yet today. If you want to become a member, it's really cheap. It's like, I can't even remember.
$5 a month.
$5 a month, yeah.
I think I said it's less than the cost of a milkshake.
Probably, yeah, in this day.
Oh, yeah, it is, at least in Maryland. And with prices going up, it's probably less than half the cost of a milkshake.
Yes, absolutely.
And better for you than a milkshake.
Yeah, That's true, actually. I didn't even think about that. Much better for you than
And we need the donations. We really do.
Our first question is from one of our members, Sharon Novak. They say, I'm guessing FAFSA is going away. We will lose that aid. What are the chances that the Department of Education will be saved by the courts?
It's a complicated answer. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I always make that clear. I study these things. I think what Trump is doing is illegal.
Wait, hold on. Philip H. just gifted 5 memberships. Thank you so much, Philip H.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
That really helps us.
Yeah.
So I'm not a lawyer. I do believe that what Trump is doing is illegal and will probably be shot down by the lower courts. And I say a fair chance by the Supreme Court. But how long is that going to take, Sam?
Probably a while.
Could take years before it gets resolved by the Supreme Court. And in the meantime, he shut it down with all the detrimental features that I outlined in my talk at the first part of this show. This is what Trump is so good at, right, Sam? Delay, deflect, obstruct. Yeah, the courts may go after me, but by then the damage is done. You know, there's an old song that I love. I'm not going to sing it. But
no, sing it.
No.
Come on, just sing it a little bit of it.
No.
Just a little bit of it.
Humpty Dumpty was pushed. Humpty Dumpty was pushed. In other words, the basic theme is...
That wasn't so bad.
It wasn't just an accident that Humpty Dumpty fell. He was pushed. And once he was pushed, the perpetrator achieved his purpose. Because, you know, once you break the egg, it's very hard to put it back together. Once you break the department, even if you ultimately win, it's going to be very hard to put it back together. This is a lesson beyond the Department of Education. This goes to everything that Trump is doing. You know, he is counting on, even if he loses in the courts, that's going to be long delayed, and then it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to put it back, particularly since he's going to drag his feet in putting it back, just like he's dragged his feet in rehiring the people that the court said he's supposed to rehire.
Alex Kawa says that you're not the worst singer in the world. There you go.
That's the first time I've ever heard that.
Yeah. Only 696 likes. Come on, we're only halfway to our viewership. More likes. This is a $5 donation from Losty.
Thank you.
Girl. They say, I got my diploma recently, and I'm now going to begin my college education to pursue an engineering degree. What advice do you have for new students?
I don't know anything about engineering, but my advice for new students is put your head down, persist, do your work, listen to your professors, and get the best set of knowledge you possibly can. And if, in fact, what's going on politically begins to affect you, then don't be afraid to protest, to speak out, but don't do it alone. Join with your fellows. Is that good advice?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you were just a student recently, not like me.
Really?
Well,
I was a student like 8 years ago now.
Well, it beats me. I was a student over 50 years ago.
Yeah. Andrew Carlson with a $10 donation. They say, oh no, this is from Rohit Singh. $10 donation. Professor Lichtman, what are your thoughts about the future of student loans? What advice would you give to current or future borrowers?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, student loans are not abolished, but I'm very worried about the future of student loans, and also about the future of various repayment plans established under President Biden. So my advice is act quickly.
Right.
Don't wait, because you never know what Trump is going to do, and it could come unpredictably like a strike of lightning.
Right. Why is it that Trump can act like a strike of lightning, but nothing else in our government can act like this? Like, we're just talking about the Supreme Court.
Exactly.
Like, it's going to take years for the Supreme Court to act, but it's going to take all this time and energy to get Congress to act or for judges to act. But it's like Trump can seem to do whatever he wants whenever he wants. Why
Yeah,
is that?
exactly. Look, let me give you an example. The immunity decision, right? Giving Trump broad immunity from prosecution for virtually anything he does. Not quite, but close. It didn't get resolved by the Supreme Court, right? That didn't decide anything. It got bounced back to the lower courts. And that delayed the process beyond the election and killed the prosecution. So even the Supreme Court is not necessarily the final word, Sam, right? Because it might bounce the issue back to the lower courts, whatever the issue may be, say the dismantling of the Department of Education, which could well run out the clock on the entire second Trump administration and then, punt the whole problem into the next 4 years. It's really frightening. It's amazing. As you say, the president could act like a stroke of lightning, but the courts and the Congress are more like a slug trying to cross a road.
But the president shouldn't be able to act like a stroke of lightning. They have limits to their powers and their actions.
But the problem is, and I have a whole book on this.
Oh.
I have a book on everything. It's called...
Not on the opera.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
You heard my singing. You understand why I avoid the opera.
Right.
It's called 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump. And one of the things I point out is while the guardrails are there, they're very imperfect. And one of the reasons they're imperfect is while the executive can, with a stroke of a pen, do all kinds of things, Congress and the courts operate on a vastly slower time frame, especially the courts.
Gotcha. This one is from Andrew Carlson, $10 donation. They say, Professor, are there leadership opportunities for Democrats at the gubernatorial, am I saying that right?
Gubernatorial.
Thank you. Level.
Absolutely.
Wait, hold on. I'm not done.
I thought you were done.
No.
You stopped abruptly.
I know. I was recovering from that horrible pronunciation. Gubernatorial.
Gubernatorial.
Yeah. Can we discuss Wes Moore, his energy, class appeal, diverse career, and potential in the 28 election?
I love Wes Moore. He's my governor of my state of Maryland, where I've been living for 51 years.
Since you were 6.
Since I was 6. And first African-American governor of the state of Maryland, a progressive Democrat who is willing to speak out and speak his mind. That's exactly what we need in the Democratic Party. I also found him incredibly courageous in that he was one of the few Democratic leaders who stood up for Joe Biden and said, what Pelosi and Adam Schiff and George Clooney and whoever are doing was wrong. And we need to stand with our elected president and our elected nominee. That was not a particularly popular position within the establishment of the Democratic Party. But there was Wes Moore. And he may not be well known enough in one term as governor to run for president. But he's young, and he has his options, and I think he's a bright star.
But don't you always say that Democrats do best with the lesser-known, more charismatic candidates?
That is true. Good point. They come out of nowhere. Yes, saying. Thanks for reminding me.
Obama hadn't even finished his first term in the Senate yet, had
Hardly.
he? Yeah.
Just had begun it. And before that, he was a state senator.
Yeah, and was Clinton, he was...
Governor of Arkansas, yeah. That was it. Jimmy Carter was governor of Georgia.
See?
Yeah.
Wes Moore, 28.
I think I've told you this story before. There was this show way back in the 70s called What's My Line? And it had this celebrity panel that would try to guess what their guests did, and the guests would try to fool them. And Jimmy Carter came on, and none of them had a clue of who he was. Not a clue. And this was a celebrity panel that does this kind of thing.
Our next question. Will Trump come for citizens next after he came after permanent residents and undocumented immigrants?
I'm going to answer that with a parable from Pastor Niemöller in Nazi Germany.
Uh-oh.
Pastor Niemöller wrote, "First they came for the Jews, and I didn't care because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I didn't care because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't care because I wasn't a Catholic. And then they came for me."
There you go. Our next question. Why did Trump want RFK Jr.? Trump is an idiot, but no way is he getting vaccines. Trump is an idiot, but no way is he not getting vaccines. Sorry. Do you think he wants people to do so? Do you think he wants people to do so? Those left are easier to control.
Absolutely. I had a whole post saying, don't call it chaos, call it a coup. But part of the coup is to create chaos. And you create these health problems. Of course, you blame them on the Democrats, right? And that kind of chaos does advance the Trump agenda. And while I can't prove this, but, you could speculate. I don't like to speculate. I'll just throw it out there. Could there have been a quid pro quo, Sam, that Trump promised him HHS in return for RFK Jr.'s support in the general election at a time when it was very uncertain that Trump would win?
Interesting. I haven't thought about it that explicit. I mean, maybe there wasn't like an explicit,
doesn't have
handshake
to be
or written. Or you're gonna get. He probably said, hey, drop out. I got your back, or something. Something general like that.
Or it may have been specific. Who knows?
Maybe. What do you mean by Elon, quote, bought the election? You said that earlier in the episode.
Yeah. I've talked about this before.
Have you?
Yes.
Oh.
Disinformation.
Sit up a little bit. You're sinking.
I've talked about this before. It's not campaign ads or anything like that. It's using his billions and using his control over X to spread vast amounts of disinformation in the election as someone only with the kind of financial and social power that Elon Musk held. There were reports that upwards of 2 billion people saw the disinformation that Musk had put out. And I pointed to what I thought was the most critical example: disinformation on abortion, about which he devoted tens of millions of dollars. When you look at the exit polls, and this, by the way, is in my new book, Conservative at the Core, A New History of American Conservatism. It's coming out September 1, University of Notre Dame Press. But please, you can pre-order it at the University of Notre Dame Press website or at Amazon. And then you'll get it as soon as it comes out. And we'll be talking about it after it generally comes out. And I talk a lot about the disinformation, particularly on the abortion issue. I note in the book, Conservative at the Core, that based on exit polls, 66% of voters were pro-choice compared to about 30% that were anti-choice. It's a 36-point gap. Do you know what the gap was between Harris and Trump on the abortion issue? It wasn't 36.
I don't know.
It wasn't 15. It wasn't 10. It wasn't 5. It was 3 points.
Right. I think you mentioned that before.
Yeah. 1/10 of what the actual gap was. If the gap had just been even 10 points, less than a third, it would have been many millions of more votes for Harris, and she would have won the election going away.
Do you see Trump, through Doge and executive order, try to end Federal Reserve independence? And if he does, what will that mean for the U.S. economy? How will the politicalization of monetary policy, what effect will that have on the U.S. economy?
One word: disaster. You need impartial economic professionals running the Federal Reserve who are not manipulating our economy for political reasons. I'm not an economist, just like I'm not a lawyer, but I do study these matters. And those who are expert at economics, many of them argue that even more important in setting the American economy's agenda is the Federal Reserve. And it's a check also on the president. President is politically driven, not just Trump. Well, Trump is the extreme, but all presidents have their political agenda. The Fed is supposed to be at least largely independent. You destroy that independence, then our economy becomes hostage to politics.
What do you have to say to people that claim the Democrats do nothing to help the working class?
Yes, I've talked about that. And there are lots of people who say that, and that's not a failure of substance on the part of Democrats. It is a colossal failure of messaging and information. Sam, what are the most important federal initiatives that help ordinary Americans?
Social Security.
Who passed Social Security?
A Democrat.
Do you know who it was?
FDR.
FDR and a Democratic Congress. What else?
Medicare, Medicaid.
And who passed those?
A Democrat.
Lyndon Johnson, Democratic Congress. And, of course, the Affordable Care Act under Barack Obama and Democratic Congress. How many Republicans voted for the Affordable Care Act? Zero. And yet, can you think of anything comparable passed by a Republican president and Republican Congress that directly improved the lives of ordinary Americans?
No.
No, the closest would be the Americans with Disability Act under George H.W. Bush, but it was also a Democratic Congress, so not quite comparable. And yet, nobody seems to know this. They seem to think, Democrats don't care and have done nothing for ordinary Americans. It's the most colossal failure of messaging probably in the history of the country.
One of our Discord questions from the night. If you want to join our Discord, the link to that is in our link tree in the description of this video. This one's from Mike Madness. They say, question for the professor. Many historians agree that the actions of the Confederates classify as acts of treason. Do you believe from a historical standpoint that the actions of J6 rioters and or Donald Trump fall under the same category?
No, I don't. I'm not accusing Donald Trump of treason. He's not waging war against the United States. And treason, pretty much its definition has to be at a time of war. I don't like to use hyperbole. There's enough to criticize with Donald Trump without doing what he's done, calling people like General Milley a traitor who should be executed, It's beyond any kind of humane norm. So, no, I don't call Trump a traitor, but I do think he is a clear and present danger to our democracy and our freedoms. That's big enough.
Feels pretty big. In a recent live show, you discussed anti-Semitism. Can you explore how anti-imperialist views are sometimes labeled as anti-Semitism? Additionally, are you familiar with the work of Norm Finkelstein, a scholar whose parents were Holocaust survivors, and how his perspectives might inform this discussion?
I think I have read something from him, but it doesn't come to mind immediately. And I think, you're on to something. I had mentioned, I think, the Georgetown student who was detained, and then there was a student at Columbia who was also detained, supposedly for their ties to Hamas. And I don't.
Let's put that in brackets.
Yes, that's why I said supposedly. Yeah. I may not agree with their political views, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you bring down the apparatus of the state upon them and you detain and try to deport those who are here legally. There is a strong anti-imperialist tradition in America, which could be in some ways interpreted as anti-Semitic, and sometimes it certainly does fall into that category very, very sadly. But I think the big mistake that Donald Trump makes is to equate opposition to Netanyahu with anti-Semitism. I'm a Jew. I'm not anti-Semitic. I've been for over 50 years as staunch a supporter of the State of Israel as anyone. I've even written about this. However, I am not a supporter of Netanyahu. I believe Netanyahu has been terrible, not just for the Palestinians, but for Israel, that he's made Israel an international pariah. So it's very important to distinguish between anti-Semitism and opposition to the particular government that's running Israel, just as opposition to the Trump administration does not mean you're anti-American.
Why are we bombing Yemen, now declaring war on Iran? Please explain how Trump can do this. I thought a declaration of war was required by Congress. Are you I haven't heard anything about Iran.
I haven't either. He's justified his attack on the Houthis in Yemen because of their attack on shipping in the Gulf. However, we've engaged in dozens upon dozens of wars, going all the way back to the administration of Thomas Jefferson and the war against the Barbary pirates. Even before that, under George Washington, the wars against the Indian nations. And presidents have assumed this power as being commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And in recent years, declarations of war have pretty much become obsolete. When was our last declared war, Sam? The big one.
The big one?
World War II.
Oh.
We haven't had a declared war in over 80 years. That includes Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. None of these were declared wars. And in fact, the Korean War, we didn't even have a resolution of Congress. It was a quote-unquote police action of the United Nations that had no sanction whatsoever within the United States.
Interesting. With authoritarianism on the rise and democratic institutions under siege, what are the most urgent and effective actions we as citizens can take right now to prevent the U.S. from sliding into a dictatorship, whether it's protecting voting rights, combating disinformation, or holding officials accountable? What strategies have historically worked, and what must we do differently today to ensure democracy survives?
Oh, a small question. How do we save democracy? I think I'm going to, reiterate something that I've said before, but that's very important. There's no one thing that you can do to save democracy, unfortunately. But there are a lot of things you can do to try to preserve our democracy. Most importantly, organize and vote. Elections have consequences. If just a few seats had flipped in the House and the Senate, then things might have been very different in a second Trump term. Secondly, support organizations like CREW or the ACLU that are fighting the depredations on our democracy. 3, if you're a lawyer, get involved in the actions and the lawsuits to protect our democracy. Speak out, protest, vote with your feet, like the demonstrators did in the civil rights movement or the anti-war movement. Contact your senators and representatives. This is an all-out struggle to protect our democracy, and it's a struggle that's got to be fought on multiple fronts. There's no single answer.
I think if you're interested in that too, check out our last video with Glenn Kirshner.
Oh yeah, that's great.
He had some really good ideas. It's interesting. My mom and I were talking yesterday or the day before about, there was like Keith Ellison on, and he's like, we're winning in the court of public opinion, and we had this big debate about what does that mean, who cares,
Yeah, your mom had some very astute comments about that. Exactly. What does that mean? How does that translate into stopping Trump? Does he really care? I guess he would care if he was up for re-election again, but that doesn't seem likely, despite his musing about becoming a Putin serving indefinitely. But he couldn't care less about the court of public opinion. He does what he does, which is no different than what he's been doing for over 50 years, ever since he was caught by the Department of Justice allegedly violating, and I think the case was very strong, the Fair Housing Act by discriminating against minorities in New York City and his real estate company. He has never, in over 50 years, been held accountable for anything. So he is without restraints. He is without guidelines. He can do anything he wants, and with some good reason, he thinks he's going to get away with it.
All right, we're over 10 o'clock. You want one more?
We are? Wow. 2 more questions. We've been burning here.
Burning?
Burning.
Oh.
Burning.
This is from Hillary Hacks. They say, when you look at other democracies that have fallen to autocracy, what were the steps and how closely has the current administration followed those steps? What was the timeline and how does this administration compare?
Well, that's too big a question for 10:02, but I'll say what I kind of said at the beginning of this live session. The critical thing is, in the modern era, controlling education, controlling information, controlling people's minds. That's what we've seen in places like Turkey that moved in an authoritarian direction, or Viktor Orban's Hungary, or Putin's Russia. There are a lot of other things involved as well, but that really is, as Guriev and Treisman have explained, the hallmark of modern dictatorship.
Someone said, don't bother asking questions. They don't take questions unless you donate. That's not true.
Not true.
Actually, let me see. The majority of the questions we've answered tonight are from our members. So you don't have to donate. You can become a member. It's $5 a month.
Half of what it costs to get a milkshake.
Yes.
And this is much more nutritious than a milkshake.
Right.
But we do love our donors.
We got to make some money. Jackson, this is our final question of the night.
Yes, final question.
Jackson's fight against the Second Bank of America, and how and why a reserve came to be and what necessitates it.
And how and why what?
Why the reserve came to be and what necessitates it.
I don't understand. And why the reserve happened?
Here's the question. You see it?
I mean, I know a lot about the war on the bank, but I don't understand what he's saying about the reserve.
The Federal Reserve?
There was no Federal Reserve until the Wilson administration. Well, anyway, I'll give a brief commentary. Again, we could spend a whole class on the Jackson administration. Trump loves him because he was very much a unitary executive, and he waged, through executive action, a war on the Bank of the United States, kind of a very preliminary precursor to the much later Federal Reserve System, because he thought the bank gave special privilege to the rich elite. But he had his own elites. They just weren't the same elites that controlled the bank. So when he got money out of the bank, he kind of spread it around among his bank allies, and the result was a pretty nasty economic downturn that he had passed on to his successor, Martin Van Buren.
All right, with that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for this night, March 20th, 2025. Some shout-outs to some donators who didn't get their questions answered or just donated.
We tried. We went, 5 minutes overtime.
Krasimir Boyanov, Kate A., Sam I Am, Nolan, Ivana Tinkle, Channel 1, Texas. Thank you all who donated.
And you can still donate, right?
All who are watching. We got 8 members tonight. That's
awesome.
And then thank you to Philip H., who donated 5 of those. So shout out to you, Philip H. I think that's it for tonight, Dad. What are your final words to the people?
Hold steadfast to the truth. As the great philosopher Hannah Arendt said, if you lose the truth, then you lose everything.
Right. And I saw a couple people asking about the post show. The post show is coming back soon. I'm actually currently working on a area to stream from, so it's a work in progress. So right now I'm just
moved.
right now I'm just in my dad's office, so it's not a very good place because he's got to work here. I can't really stream from here. So be patient. Hope I will be back soon. Good night.
Good night. See you next Tuesday.